Hope we can get the slides up soon, but let me already get started. I think the main point I'm trying to make here is that if we truly want to prevent or mitigate food and humanitarian crisis, and if you truly want to reach the most vulnerable, we simply will need to, we cannot do without engaging with and focusing on women. Similarly, interventions that are not gender sensitive, responsive, transformative will automatically further increase the gender gap in achievements and reduce women's agency and empowerment. So this is why I'm very pleased that we do have a presentation on this topic today. So just first a few points on what are some of the gendered vulnerabilities that we are seeing in food and humanitarian crisis. So clearly women and girls are more at risk of hunger and malnutrition because of the gendered inequalities in access to productive resources, services, and agency. One statistic in 2021, before the aggression on Ukraine, at least 150 million more women than men were experiencing food insecurity. I've already mentioned the reduced access of women to resources and agency, and basically the crisis deepen and widen these access gaps. Women's assets additionally are often disposed of first in order to pay for medicine, transportation, whatever it takes after jobs are lost. And the reason is that they're often more liquid and often secondary to households' main livelihood activity, which is, let's say, land. So land is usually disposed of last. Food and humanitarian crises are also more likely to result in girls rather than boys being pulled out of school. We've seen that again during COVID-19. We've seen it again in the acceleration of the crisis with the aggression on Ukraine. We also see more child marriages. So girls basically are marrying earlier to deal with the income loss and then food price shocks. This has long-term implications for women's reproductive health, income earning opportunities, and well-being for themselves and their children. So it's an intergenerational challenge. Moreover, we continue to see responses to food and humanitarian crisis that further increase gender gaps. Fertilizer subsidies, e-wallets, digital cash transfers. Often, if women don't have access to those digital tools, they will actually increase gender gaps. And so we have to do better. Over the spring, we have done phone surveys with 500 to 1,000 women and men in a couple of Feed the Future countries to understand gendered impacts, gendered experiences of the aggression and of the war in Ukraine. And I'm just showing a few of the results that again just further demonstrate the gendered vulnerabilities. So this one shows, that's the example of Honduras, that women serve as a shock absorber by more quickly reducing food consumption, by reducing dietary diversity. So in most of these indicators here, women fare worse. Similarly, this is an example from northern Ghana. As we've already heard, I think we haven't focused sufficiently on this, but we've heard a lot that fuel is not just a food price crisis, it's a fuel price crisis, it's a fertilizer price crisis, it's a water access crisis. Those crises all come together, and the experiences and the responses, they differ, but they're interacting. And the fuel price crisis affects nutrition as well. Here I highlighted in light green, the women's response to higher fuel prices in northern Ghana has been that they went less to the market. That of course directly affects dietary diversity in the household. This is another responses from Bangladesh where we said, okay, what have you done? And here in response to higher food prices, and I highlighted in red that women more likely reduced school fees, so they couldn't pay, I guess, for their daughters to go to school. They're much less likely to be able to recharge their mobile phones. They often have to give up their mobile phones. They also were not able to attend to livestock needs, and that again is a direct implication for animal source food access. And finally, access to finance, of course, and credit and borrowing is very gendered. Generally, women's access to these sources remain quite localized. This is an example from northern Ghana. But on the positive side here, women seem to really have been able to get a wider variety of credit sources, including informal lenders, acquaintances, etc. So the final one I've already mentioned, that we see generally an increased number or occurrence of child marriages in these crises. Here we just asked in the 3 countries, rural areas, have you observed an increase in child marriages linked to both higher fuel and food prices? Bangladesh, men and women said about 7% linked to these crises. In northern Ghana, 18% of women noticed it and 12% of men. Honduras, the opposite, 13% of men and 8% of women noticed higher child marriages. And these are just responses from Bangladesh. What they felt was the reason of higher child marriages specifically linked to those crises. And I guess the key response from women was uncertainty about the economic situation of the bride or groom or their household. Also, interestingly, women observed in a few cases the groom's sudden return to village following still the COVID-19 lockdown. So that also led to increased child marriages. So what can we do about it? So the first one is to promote women's leadership for crisis prevention and mitigation. Crisis prevention first. We know when women are in leadership, more money goes into welfare and less into military. I think we heard this morning from Pope Francis that the more money goes into military, the larger our food crisis today. I think perfect correlation. If we get women into this mix, we can make a difference. And similarly, it's very important to ensure that women's groups' voices are heard and formally represented in all walks of life, in all decision-making processes. We know when this happens, crisis planning and crisis responses will be more equitable and they will be more effective. To do that, we really have to strongly, directly support women's groups and networks. We have actually recently suggested for donors to invest at least 5% of all of their funding for in the climate change response, to directly send it to grassroots women's organizations in low and middle income countries. Unfortunately, we haven't had anyone signing up to that suggestion yet, but we know that these women's groups are directly linked to the most vulnerable populations in terms of crisis. They are also able to serve as platforms to share labor responsibilities, organize childcare, transportation, credit, and disseminating information. They pretty much do everything and can do everything and have done so quite successfully during the COVID-19 crisis. We need to constantly, continually, and much more support to reduce gender-based violence. There are conditional cash transfers to keep girls in school that have been successful. There have been successful approaches to directly engage with women and men and religious leaders. Again, good to see here in this setting. And of course, we need to expand access to health, trauma, and legal services for victims of these crimes. Access to information is really essential. We do know there's a very large gendered gap in access to mobile internet and to smartphones, largest in South Asia, less so in sub-Saharan Africa, but still substantial. And really, we need to support women not just to get access to those tools, we also have to help them to use those tools, financial literacy, numeracy, etc. A lot more needs to be done if we truly want to make a difference and if we truly want to use all those modern digital tools. Right now, they increase the gender gap in access to resources and achievements. We, of course, also need to do yet much better in tailoring financial services to women. We know what we need to do about it, but it's very surprising that in most cases, banks, microfinance sometimes is doing a better job, but most government programs are still not doing the job they should be doing to reach women. This is simply the case. We find it all the time. We need to expand social protection programs. I think we've heard a lot, might be hearing yet more about it. We know they work. We've heard from PSNP very clearly, serves as a shock absorber. Families that have access to social protection do better during climate crisis and other crises. We need to especially expand those programs to women who work in the informal sector. And we have to protect these programs right now when all the governments have run out of money, all those governments who are very close to debt default. Of course, we have to increase opportunities for women to get access to decent work in refugee camps, in displacement situations. I think we generally focus on trying to find economic opportunities for men, but we need to find economic opportunities for women as well. And finally, there's a lot of understanding that we need to gather evidence. There's a lot of assessment now in the design of more gender responsive programs, but there's very little in terms of the monitoring of the gender benefit streams, of the sometimes increased violence linked to those women-focused programs. And there's very little ex post, 5 years, 10 years down the line. Did any of these programs have long-term gender benefits or not? With that, I'll leave you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you. Excellent.